Hi there. Welcome to the next episode in this series on the book The Fate of Empires by Arthur John Hubbard, and just a brief analysis. On this podcast today, I kind of live in, you can call it semi-rural area, and the internet that we have out here is virtually a line of sight type of internet. We have a lot of farm fields around us, and the farmers have put corn in, and whenever they put corn in across the field, from our house, it grows up high enough to where it kind of influences and impacts that line of sight. It's something that, we're working with, but on the video-based podcast, specifically on Spotify and YouTube, I am not going to have a video version for this podcast. It is going to be audio only. However, either A, when they're done with harvest, or B, if I'm able to update or figure out with the internet company that it's a very small company, it only services a very small element of the community out here, just because it's not very rural, but it's somewhat rural and rural enough to have that type of internet connection. So that's the reason for no video on this. If you are watching on YouTube or Spotify, if you're on any of the other platforms, business as usual. So looking forward to getting into this second part of this series, specifically as it relates to the changes that Augustus was making in Rome as a result of coming to power, transitioning from the Republic to the Empire. In the first episode, we talked about his changes in his attempt to kind of revitalize or rehabilitate religion in the Roman Empire of the day. And today, what we're going to talk about is that second historical example or analysis. And there was multiple given. There was also an element of society and societal. We'll touch on that briefly today, but I wanted to do these two specifically. And today is going to be the re-incentivizing of the family. So what I want to do is, just from a brief introductory perspective in this episode, is I kind of want to go through a very bare bones and relatively quick history behind this, and what Augustus did in terms of the Lex Julia laws he implemented. But what Arthur John Hubbard is arguing is a culture of the day. And this culture, he argues, was not specific to what's the word I'm looking for? It wasn't specific to the aristocratic or the patrician or the high society of ancient Rome. This was something that he argues took place all the way down to the lowest levels of society, from the highest to the lowest. And what I want to do is I want to take that kind of cultural reality that Arthur John Hubbard paints and see if there's any potential connection, reflection, mirror of that in our society today. And as I close out this introduction before we get into the nuts and bolts of the episode, I've been listening to quite a few podcasts recently. I listen to a lot of them anyway, just because I have time and space at work, and it allows me to do it. The type of work I do, it allows me to listen to things as I'm working. So it's very conducive to that. And one of the things that I've realized is sensationalism sells. Is kind of what I've learned. Is sensationalism sells, and many of these podcasts are just on repeat of the same problems, the same issues, the same things over and over and over and over again. And it's one of those things of, a lot of these things that are being talked about in some of these podcasts, they've been talked about for literally coming up on almost 10 years now. And as I'm listening to that, what I'm thinking about in terms of the podcast that I'm trying to do, which is a very small podcast, and I wouldn't even say small, I think tiny would probably be the better word. A tiny podcast, tiny reach. It's very self-edifying for me, and I love trying to learn as I go. What I want to do is ensure that I want it to be known that as I'm painting these cultural similarities, right? The objective for me in this is learning. And if anybody else can potentially have an interest in learning some of the things that I'm kind of vocalizing, because vocalizing them helps me put my thoughts together, which then in turn would help me to be able to communicate it if I ever get into conversations in real life and in the world, which is why I think it's valuable. And, the process and today's process of recording podcasts and then posting them online is relatively simple. It's the platform I use is called Riverside FM, and you literally upload directly into this and through its studio. It's AI will completely edit the entire episode for you if you want to do it that way. So the reason I say all that is I present reflections or similarities between ancient Rome and us. I am not trying to do it from the perspective of, hey, this is a sensational issue. If we don't change it, everything's going to be destroyed. That's not what I'm trying to get at. What I'm trying to get at is hey, we are a Western civilization just as the Romans were a Western civilization. I think that it's a healthy thing to consider realities around us that have potentially occurred before, and then think about from a common sense perspective how we can identify those realities, maybe gain some understanding about those, and then see about how we can then use that as a mechanism for having positive influence and impact in our day-to-day lives, in the sphere and in the circle and in the community in which we find ourselves. Right? You can listen to podcasts all you want about the chaos of the Middle East. You can listen to podcasts all you want about the reality of huge overarching social issues in the United States or political issues in the United States. You can listen to these massive, massive issues such as communism making a reappearance in a nation like the United States, or modern socialism, or modern socialist feminism, and all of these huge overarching realities that are taking place and influencing our culture. But the simple fact is this: when it comes to the vast majority of those issues, you have one mechanism, I have one mechanism, we have one mechanism for having any influence on that at all, and that is voting. And so it's all about being informed so that you can then execute that action in a very meaningful and a very matterful way. That's literally it. Everything else apart from that is just entertainment for the sake of entertainment when it comes specifically to podcasting. So what I want to be really sure to do is, I'm just kind of closing out this relatively long-winded introduction, is I want anybody who would take the time to listen to know that as I present these topics, I'm presenting them from a heart of an educational perspective, of more educational for myself, and vocalizing them into a podcast helps me to learn it more. And it's a very simple, quick process to do, and I'm trying to do it with quality, so I'm not putting a bad product out by any means. So that anybody were to listen, it's somewhat enjoyable and manageable to listen to. However, in the end, it's a very selfish thing on my end because I learn a lot by vocalizing things. And this is a healthy way to do it so that my wife doesn't have to sit there and just think to herself, dear God, will he stop? So that's one of the reasons that I'm trying to do this podcast is well. And I just want to be really sure to reinforce, I do not want to encourage sensationalism. I do not want to encourage anxiousness or fear. Because I got home the other day and I was listening to a lot of different things regarding just the climate of the world as a whole. And what I noticed is when I got home that evening, and it was, I think, 2 days ago, when I got home, I realized that I had almost a heaviness on my heart, on my soul, on my mind. And it genuinely impacted how I interacted with my children and my wife and my family. And I was really taken aback by that. I was really, really, really humbled by that because I realized, hey, the stuff that we put in our heads, the stuff that we put in our minds, these things do matter. They do matter. And I learned that lesson the hard way the other day. And so what I want to ensure that I do in this podcast is I never want anybody to leave this podcast with a heavier heart, a heavier soul than it was before they listened. And that doesn't mean that I'm not going to try to tackle hard topics, because I am. I mean, the next episode, as I was preparing for this one, I realized that looking at the incentivization of the family in ancient Rome, and as I kind of dug into that, topic, I realized there was a whole different topic that needed to be discussed regarding this, because I started to look at some things that led me to the point of kind of socialism, and then I found myself in the Communist Manifesto. And then I found myself kind of, digging into the mind of Karl Marx a little bit, and then just looking at, okay, this is what, Marxism is. Because you hear these things all the time: Marxism, fascism, liberalism, communism. I hear them, and I thought about it the other day, and I was like, what if somebody asked me, because I said it on a podcast, and I go, okay, hey, I'm Joe Schmo number one, and I heard something on your podcast, and I type in a message. And it is, hey, what is fascism? And I thought to myself, I genuinely could not right now, if somebody walked up to me, I couldn't answer that question. I could not answer with a good, solid understanding of what fascism truly is, other than to point at the fact of, oh, it's the Nazis. They were fascists. It's like, okay, can you give me 2 other examples throughout history of fascist governments? And I realized that I would have been found wanting had I been asked that question. And so the reason that I say all of that is I don't want, I don't want to go into a podcast with in a way that, people leave with a heavier heart than what it is before I started, or before they started listening. However, that's not going to keep me from tackling hard topics like the next podcast, which is going to be on Marxism modern socialism and the family. Because I realized as I was studying for this portion, there is an entire episode to be had on that, because socialism, modern socialism, syncretistic in a way when it comes to Marxism and Marxist doctrine and philosophy, and then also the reality of communism and just the some of the shades and some of the mirror images that we're seeing of that in our culture. I think it's worthwhile to understand, okay, how does that impact the family? And it's going to go in line with this podcast. It's not how it impacts the family. It's not how it impacts economics. It's not how it impacts the idea of production and the means of production and who owns it and who doesn't own it. It doesn't come down to the abolishment of individual liberties. It doesn't come down to the apparatus of the state being the mechanism to help steward and guide and lead everybody through this materialistic philosophy that human beings and their nature ebbs and flows depending on the material outcomes of their lives. So the whole reason that we have this horrific reality in our world is because it's out of balance, right? We have the bourgeoisie who owns all the material or all the means of production, and those at the bottom are just getting poorer and poorer, and the richer are getting richer and richer, and we need to use the state as the mechanism by which we bring this material balance together. And then once we get to that point, human nature will adjust itself because nobody will be wanting. And as a result of that, all the human nature in the world will then turn into being able to, now that everybody's on an equal playing field, equity, right? There's a difference between equality and equity. Now that everybody's on an equitable field and everybody's at the same place, since the nature of man is driven by the material realities of our lives, now guess what? The state can abolish itself. It can disappear because human beings will then turn to meaningful and matterful and desirable labor that will be beneficial for all. And then we reach this utopianistic idea that communist speaks of. What is all that predicated on? All of it. It's predicated on one primary assumption, that there is no God. The whole premise is atheistic. That is assumption number one. That then in turn says, okay, well, if there is no God, if there is no maker, if there is no creator, if there is no divine or eternal reality that governs our reality, then I can then take this Marxist philosophy, who then employs the reality of hierarchy being a result of nothing more than it is a result of capitalism, right? Marxism is literally just an economic philosophy. However, it is a philosophy that is predicated on atheism, and it is predicated on a nature of man assumption that I believe runs fundamentally counter to the reality of the world. And then that is why they look at the family in the way that they do. So that is why I want to have that conversation in the next episode. And the reason I give that entire example is because I want everybody to know that I want them to leave this podcast, if they listen, I want them to leave it with a lighter heart than it was when they came. And it's like, well, how can you do that when you're talking about Marxism, when you're talking about things that are death, really, in the end is what they are. They run counter to the reality of the world around us, and they try to fight against the reality that has been set forth by a creator. And it's like, how can I leave lighter in my heart than I was when I listened to it at first? And that's because I want to ensure that at the end of episodes like that, or during it, or the beginning of the whole thing, all the way through, I want it to be clearly understood that there is one thing that my worldview and my assumption brings to bear that allows me to roll through these topics and come out on the other side hopeful. And that is, as I've said in a previous episode, that there is hope. There is great hope. Because the nature of man is fallen. That's why socialism, Marxism, communism, that's why it'll never work. It's because it's predicated on a foundational, fundamental, flawed understanding of the nature of man. The nature of man is that we are sinners. We are sinful beings. That is our natural leaning. And there is a remedy for that. And there's only one remedy for that. And his name is Jesus. And so that's why anybody who listens to an episode on this podcast, I want, whether they share that worldview or not, whether that person considers Jesus, whether they don't, whether they receive Jesus, whether they reject him, whatever their choice may be, they can leave this podcast with a lighter heart, knowing that I am conveying these topics and talking through these topics from a heart of hope. And I don't have that hope because I'm wise or smart or understanding. I have that hope because God has had mercy on me. period, full stop. And so I've said it before, and I say it again at the conclusion of this probably 15-minute introduction. Pretty sweet, huh? I'm not a pastor. I'm not going to try to be a pastor. If you want that, you need to find a local Bible-believing church and go to get that, if that's what you want. That's not what's going to be on this podcast. I just wanted to be very clearly known, as I've seen and observed, especially what I saw the other day in myself and how I just came back and, it impacted my home and my family. I was really reminded that, hey, even though I post a podcast that has a very small audience, a tiny audience, a tiny reach, very little impact, one human being is valuable enough that the God of the universe himself would come to redeem them. And so the fact that, if this podcast even reaches one set of ears, I have to take into account that in and of itself is one human being who has eternal value. And therefore, every word spoken matters, right? So that's the mindset, that's the heart for me. And I want to present things, even though they may be dark and hard and difficult, there is great hope to be found. There's one quote that I just wanted to share that I think kind of gives credence to what I'm trying to say. And that is simply this, and that is that the light has shined in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And so with that being in mind, I can delve into topics that are hard, that are difficult, that are challenging, trying to pull and understand meaning out of it. Or if we can't understand the meaning of it, we can understand how others associate the meaning to it. Therefore, we can then understand people better and then meet people on a level playing field better and have a good discussion, and then also be equipped to listen, right? I've said that from the first podcast that I've done, and I want to keep that going all the way through. And then I hope to demonstrate that through interviews that I potentially may have one day down the road. When it comes to interviews and the goal of having interviews in this podcast, I wanted to lay a foundation of getting probably 6, 7 to 10 episodes done and uploaded, so that if anybody ever were to consider coming on the podcast for any reason, there would be plenty. There would be a significant enough catalog for people to be able to listen to some different podcasts, hear some different topics, understand who I am, what my worldview is. What my statements, claims, what my declaration of faith is, so that if people were to choose to not want to associate themselves with someone like myself, they would be able to get the information that they need not to do that. Or if they would like to come on and have a conversation, they will. So I just give that to anybody who might be a listener, to just let them know that my goal is probably within the next 3 to 5 episodes, I want to try to get my first guest on. And then try to have my goal in this podcast is, number one, like I've said, self-edification learning, but also my goal is to eventually make it to where I'm just having conversations with people. And whether that's 2 a month, whether that's 1 a month, whether that's 4 a month, like that would be my dream come true on this podcast, is to be able to just have great conversations with other people. And that would be my goal. So that's almost a 20-minute introduction. So yeah, you're welcome. And I allowed myself to just kind of ramble there, just because those were just some of the things that I've been thinking about. And so looking forward to transitioning now over into today's topic. I'll try to be a little bit more brief and succinct, since I allowed myself a little bit of liberty on the introduction portion of this. But hopefully in the next 20 to 30 minutes following the intro, we can get a good understanding of what the Roman culture was in the day of Caesar Augustus, why he then felt the Lex Julia laws would have been matterful and meaningful, and then how then in turn can we maybe potentially look at the Roman culture of the day and see if there's any parallels between ours, and what are some of the things that we might potentially be able to think about and consider in light of that. So we'll see you on the other side. What is your worldview? How does that worldview shape and form your understanding of meaning? In this podcast, we discuss various matters of interest and value. But in the end, we want to know the deeper meaning of these matters and how they apply to the world around us and to ourselves. My name's Jonathan. Join me as I search out deeper meaning and understanding into the matters at hand. All right, so transitioning from what I would probably consider to be the longest introduction in the history of podcasts. It's all right. Yeah, let's go ahead and delve into the topic of the day. So When it comes to the historical examples that Hubbard lays out, there's two that I wanted to talk about. We talked about that way back in the beginning of the introduction. Previously, we touched on the religious revitalization or rehabilitation, and today we're going to touch on the re-incentivizing of the family. So the key word on this that we want to take away as we kind of dig into this podcast today is incentivize. And it's because why is the term incentivize used? It's because the culture of the day, Hubbard argues, was the opposite of it. So people were being drawn in a different direction than from a family or having families, and there was a pull in an opposite direction culturally or socially, and therefore re-incentivizing people to turn and kind of 180 from those draws in that direction, and then incentivize them to go the other way, right? So that's why I use the term incentivize. So hopefully what that'll do is that'll kind of give a solid understanding of kind of the arc that we're going to go on. The culture's going in one direction. He wants to get people to go in the other direction, and he incentivizes them through the Lex Julia laws to do that. So again, so looking into this episode today as we talk about the family, this is going to be more of a social and cultural context. And as I, on a marathon laid out in the introduction, on the next episode, we're going to touch on Marxism and modern socialism in the United States and how there's philosophical, ideological, political, economic pressures coming from Marxism or a syncretistic version of Marxism and modern socialism in America, and then why we're seeing why we're seeing what we've seen in America in terms of the culture against the family that has grown. Now, it's not by any means overarching, but it has grown. And the things that culture would look at and perceive today about the family would not have existed even 15, 20 years ago. So that's the next episode. But today is social and cultural when it comes to trying to connect to the ancient past. I would argue first and foremost up front that I believe that the family is the staple of civilization. I think that a civilization that doesn't have it, will not grow. And I think that a civilization that flourishes with it and then loses it will collapse. And so I'm going to give two people from the ancient past who would agree with me about the family. The first is going to be Confucius. In the 6th century BC, he said from great learning, and this was attributed to Confucius and his followers. So kind of, fact check that, but it may not have been him directly. However, from his day, from his area of the world is, quote, to put the world in order, we must first put the nation in order. To put the nation in order, we must put the family in order. To put the family in order, we must cultivate our personal life, end quote. And then also, it was said in Analects, chapter 1, that filial piety and fraternal submission, are they not the root of all benevolent actions? And so filial, in the end, what that's talking about is the duty of a father, the duty of a son or the duty of a daughter. And in essence, what he's trying to get at when he says this is, hey, a good son, a good brother, a good daughter, a good sister in the family is going to be a good citizen in society. That was his argument. And then next, we're going to go to Aristotle from ancient Greece in the 4th century BC. And he said first these are both from Politics. Both of these quotes are from the same writing. So the first quote is first, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase on this quote. So I'm not going to give it a quotation announcement, but I'm just going to paraphrase two specific things from this quote. And the first is, the first society is the family. That's his first part of the quote. And then the last part of the quote is, this association is natural. So he sees the family as the primary staple of society. The family precedes the village, and then the village precedes the town, and then the town precedes the city, right? So a civilization blossoms, but it blossoms because it first was a family. And then the next one is, quote, the household is earlier and more necessary than the state, end quote. And that's his kind of idea of what I said first. Hey, if you look at it from a progressive natural reality, the family's first, and then follows by a bigger expansion of that to maybe a village, and then a bigger expansion of that to a town, and then a city, and then inevitably multiple cities, and then in a civilization. So that's kind of his argument, Aristotle's argument, which is interesting because when I say that that's what it was in the ancient world, I'm not saying all ancient writers felt the same way, because Plato, who would have been a counter to Aristotle on this point, he had a perspective that was more in line with Marxism or socialism, that would have been the abolishment of the family, and leaning more towards a communal idea of in society, where people literally don't even know who their parents are, and parents don't know who their children are. So Aristotle wasn't, there was multiple different perspectives, even in the ancient world, on the approach to this. And it just goes back to worldviews. It goes back to an understanding of how they see the world. Aristotle has an assumption that this is a natural thing. Plato has an assumption that, this is not good. This is bad. And then one has an assumption that it is good. It's like, okay, well, what are the presuppositions preceding these that are informing those assumptions, right? And so I just think that that's a really interesting point. And I just kind of wanted to get, number one, where I stand on the issue, right? I see the family as a staple of civilization. And these are two people from the ancient past who would agree with me. And then there's also going to be people from the ancient past who would disagree as well. So I just wanted to make sure that I did credence to that. So one of the things before I kind of dig into to Rome is I wanted to give this specific, I just wanted to give this specific statement. There are going to be very good and very reasonable and very legitimate reasons in culture for people to not get married. There are going to be very good, very legitimate reasons in culture for people to not have families. What I'm stating when I'm talking about the importance of the family is I am not painting a cultural reality where anybody who's not doing it is doing the wrong thing. That is not what I'm talking about when I'm in this episode. I have friends and family in my own life who have chosen to not have families. And there's good reason for the choice. What I'm arguing in this episode is in line with what Hubbard's arguing, which is that a hedonistic culture, if that is driving a decision to not have a family, I would argue that that is not a good thing, both for the individual and then also for the civilization. That is what I'm getting at on today's episode. So if you are listening to this and you don't have a family, if you're listening to this and you're not married because you've chosen not to get married, and you have perfectly sound and reasonable reasons for that, I am not trying to vilify anybody who has chosen the path of singleness. Before I was married, I got married a little later on in life. I got married in my early 30s. I was a military veteran. I was older than most people. I was in an educational location that had people that were in their young and in their early 20s who had no idea about the reality of the world. They had either been in their parents' house or they had been on the safety of a campus all their lives. And they were looking at me judgmentally because I was still single. And so I have had the eyes of people and cultures looking down upon me because I didn't meet what was, quote unquote, their cultural expectation at the time. And these people that were looking at me, it was very hard to see them look at me this way, knowing the experience that I had and the things that I had been a part of and seen and observed, and seeing young, early 20s kids looking at me that way, it was very difficult for me to navigate through that. So the reason I say all of that is I just really want to be very clear on that point. There's good reasons for people to stay single. There's good reasons for people to not have kids. However, if it's simply hedonistic, I would say that that's not a healthy thing. And so that's going to lead us straight into what Hubbard is talking about when it comes to the culture of the day in ancient Rome, right? So why would Augustus even take the time to go through instituting the Lex Julia laws? He just survived the civil wars. He finds himself now in power. He's trying not to get killed because he doesn't want to give the perception that he's a king or trying to be a king. And so all of these realities that he's facing, all of these things that he's having to deal with, and yet one of the biggest pushes that he has, apart from religious rehabilitation, is to re-incentivize the family. It's like, there's a lot going on. Why? Why is that such an important thing for him? And so the reason for that is because Hubbard argues that the culture of the day was hedonistic. Now, hedonism is something that I never really understood. It was a word that I heard, and it sounded like Hellenistic. So I was like, is that Greek, or does that have something to do with Greece? But no. So hedonism is literally nothing more than an individual that prioritizes their personal pleasure or happiness as the most important thing in their reality, right? So pleasure or happiness, these are the highest good. They're the ultimate aim of life. So one pursues things in life to minimize pain or discomfort and to maximize their own pleasure, right? It's literally nothing more than the full-on pursuit of one's own happiness, and anything that influences that happiness is not something that you should have. And if it is there, you need to rid yourself of. So that's what Hubbard argues was the reality of the day. And he says from the book, specifically regarding this, he says, quote, We are contemplating a temper of mind almost inconceivable to ourselves. To exercise restraint was to waste the fleeting days. Gratification of the senses was the aim of life. End quote. So that's what he was talking about when it comes to hedonism. So this culture of hedonism, though, it wasn't just in Augustus's time, right? This would last for generations beyond him. And there was a few different things that he quoted as an example of this from the book that I felt were worthwhile quotes to kind of consider. And so there's going to be 3 of these as well. So the first is, quote, "The lubricity of pantomime and the slaughter of the arena were never more fiercely and keenly enjoyed than when the Germans were thundering at the gates of Treves and Carthage," end quote. And so the next one is, quote, "The municipality supplants the family, and the local amphitheater is the structure that survives," end quote. And then the last one is, quote, "Ease, it is true, was purchased by the loss of liberty, and it was found that the hand of the state was laid even more and more heavily upon every man," end quote. And so the big part from that last quote was, "Ease, it is true, was purchased by the loss of liberty." And that'll really, really have a significant impact as we talk next week. But there's one more quote that I want to give that I think is really pertinent to this. And that is a quote from, his name's Petronius. And he had a satire or a satirical writing and a cynical view of Roman society. So you can take this as with that being the reality that was written from the perspective of a satire or a cynic, or a cynical view. Take that for what it's worth and just kind of let that sink into your thinking as it regards to how you would look at this quote and how you would then apply it. But it says, or Petronius says about the culture of the day of the Romans, quote, "No one acknowledges children. For the man who has heirs is never invited to any festive gathering, but is left to associate with the dregs of society. On the other hand, the childless man is covered with honors and passes for a model of all the virtues," end quote. Arthur John Hubbard is arguing that the culture of the day in ancient Rome was the seeking and the pursuit of pleasure. And that pursuit had grown so much that the culture of the day was one that people didn't even want to have families. They didn't want to have children. The culture of the day was one that if you were to do that, it would pull you back or restrict you in the culture or in the society. And that is, in essence, why Augustus instituted the Lex Julia laws. And the main goal of these laws was to promote the traditional Roman family values, to increase the birth rate among the upper classes. Because when you think about it from a civilizational perspective, if the culture of the day is against reproduction, I mean, it really, you hate to just demean the magnitude and the intricacy of human civilization down to a very basic biological reality. However, that is in essence what this is. If people are not reproducing, the civilization is going to literally disappear, just because there's no more people coming to carry that civilization forward. And the family is the mechanism by which that is carried forward. And so he wanted to just increase the birth rates. He wanted to make sure that Romans, specifically, upper class Roman families, the patricians especially, were reproducing, because if they didn't, they would just disappear. And in the end, that's kind of what ends up, in essence, kind of happening in a way, because later on into the empire, you start having eventually Roman emperors who aren't Italians, quote unquote. They are from the far reaches of the empire, from the different provinces out from the empire. So these wouldn't be, quote unquote, actual physical Italian patrician families from Rome itself, right? Which is what would have made up the aristocracy all the way through the Republic, and what it was like to be in the Senate, I believe, for a time. So fact check that, make sure I'm right. But simply, that's one of the reasons that he's incentivizing the family, is because he's trying to incentivize the birth rate. And so he's also trying to discourage adultery and immorality, and that he's also trying to strengthen the institution of marriage. And those are just kind of general goals that he's trying to do. So one of the things that kind of fed this, and this is going to be the last part of the historical example, and then we're going to do a quick bridge into how I think this plays out in America. And not even so much in America. I think it's permeating the West, if you want to know the truth. And what I say by the West is, think about the United Kingdom. Think about, places like France. Think about places like the United States, right? These Western powers post-World War II. I think that it's impacting all of us. However, the stats and the things that I'm going to use, I'm going to argue specifically on, as regards to marriage, or as regards to the United States, or my culture. So one of the things that kind of helped feed this was the types of marriage that existed. So there was a confarreatio, which was a religious or sacramental type wedding. There was the temptio, which was more symbolic or legal contractual marriage. The first one, the confarreatio. There we go. That's better. I just got to act like I'm Italian. And then, so that one is a religious, and that one's reserved for Roman citizens or patrician families. The Kemptio is that's for plebeians and patricians, so it covers a lot more of the population. And then there's the usus marriage, which is more of a common law style, and it's based on cohabitation. Those first two, divorce was difficult. And there was something called manus, which is the hand of the husband. The man dominated everything. And when a woman married a man underneath the Kemptio or the confarreatio, that actually does help. That's crazy. That actually does help. When, in those situations, when a woman married a man, she lost all ties to her natal family. All of her possessions became his, and her decision-making it became not a husband and wife. It was a father-daughter relationship, pretty much, underneath those two different types of marriage. So those would have been more common in Roman Republic earlier on, and then leading up to the time of Augustus, the usus type marriage came about, which was based on cohabitation. So a man and a woman would live together for a year, and if they lived together for a year unbroken, right, then the woman would then pass underneath the quote-unquote manus of her husband, and then everything that was in the previous types of marriage, loss of property, loss of decision-making, like loss of her natal family and everything that was, any connection to her previous life was all gone, and everything fell now underneath the authority of her husband. After 1 year of unbroken cohabitation underneath the usus common style law of marriage, that would take place. However, as they were living together, if during that 1 year, right, there was a 3-night separation called the trinactium, that would void the marriage or the potential of marriage, and the woman would not have to pass into the manus or underneath the authority of her husband in the Roman world at the time. And so what ended up happening, and I think it's easy to kind of see what started to happen here. So instead of having to enter into the solidity of the marital relationship, right, you then have the opportunity to kind of have your cake and eat it too, in a way. And this isn't just for the woman. This is for the man too. This is for both. And in essence, what we're looking at when we see a marriage like this, we're looking at a mistress type marriage. You have a man who can have a mistress for a time in the ancient Roman world, and then instead of having to get married, and not only does the man have to do everything that would associate with having to, but the woman doesn't have to deal with losing everything about herself individually. And so it's like, okay, we can come together, and then we can part ways. And then you kind of have that, like I said, that kind of get your cake and eat it too type situation. And so what that did is that started to incentivize people to not get married, or that was one of the elements of it that would have incentivized, hey, there's a method of kind of getting what we want without actually having to pay the price for it in a way. And so what I want to be also very clear on is I don't obviously agree with the previous types of marriage and the complete authoritarian domination of a man over a woman. That's absolutely and unequivocally not something that I support. I'm not saying that I support that. I'm just simply saying that was the reality of the day for the Romans, right? And then this usus type marriage, which then gave them the opportunity to do something other than getting married, that was a reality for them that then incentivized, or Arthur John Hubbard argues that that incentivized people to then, hey, there's a way to do this other than to, to have a family. And so that then in turn led to what Petronius wrote inside of that cynical and that satirical writing on the ancient Roman society, is why nobody would acknowledge children. And the reality of the day was, hey, I want to get invited to things, but if I have kids in a family, I'm considered on the outs. And so what I wanted to do now is kind of looking at that reality. Is there anything in our culture today? That is similar potentially to that? And what I came across was something that's called DINK, or dual income, no kids. And so in the end, what I'm going to look at here is hedonism, is the really specific thing that I want to focus on. I don't want to focus on their types of marriage. That's not what I'm trying to get at, right? The extremeness of the male domination in Roman culture That was a reality for the ancient Romans. It's not something that I support in any way, shape, or form. That's not what I'm getting at. All right. What I'm trying to say is that instead of entering into marriage, hedonism and the opportunity to pursue their own self-interest, that is what dominated, not for just women, but for men. It's literally an entirety of the culture. This was the direction that they were going. So do we also in America live in a society where people minimize their personal discomfort and their need for personal sacrifice? And do they then maximize anything in their life that allows them to be more happy, that allows them to get the pleasure that they're seeking? Do we see that in our culture? So first and foremost, I want to just look at the reality of marriage, right? Because I think it helps paint the picture of that in our culture. So since 2000, there's been a 35 to 38% reduction or decline in marriage. In 2000, it was about 8.2 people out of 1,000 were married, and now it's 5.1. So there's a myriad of things that can influence this: delayed marriage, changing attitudes in marriage, things like the cultural acceptance of, I don't know, quote unquote, chosen or quote unquote alternative families, remaining single and being child free. And then there's also things like a cultural thing that I've heard of, which is called DINK, which is dual income, no kids. Which was a phrase that was coined in the 1980s. It was kind of during the rise of the yippie culture, so young urban professionals, and it was associated with being affluent, career-focused. You know, you're as a couple is focused on not building a family, but they're both career-focused. They're both career-minded. Hey, a family would keep us from achieving our goals, right? So that's going to be their focus. So that's kind of where it came from. And today, it kind of has a similar leaning, but it also is associated with things just like travel and leisure lifestyles. Like, hey, having a family, you can't do some of these other things. So, I'm going to prioritize careers, hobbies, and personal freedom ahead of the idea of a family. So the cultural shifts and the rise behind it, I don't know. There's definitely a cultural reality in it, and that's just an increased acceptance. If you go back to my grandparents, right? I was born in the 1980s. If you go back to when my grandparents were, middle-aged, the idea of remaining single or the idea of not having a family would have been heavily frowned upon in their culture. And I think probably to the point where it's probably unhealthy, more than likely. However, what I'm simply saying is that there has been a very easy to see cultural shift from what the boomer generation would have been in terms of what the cultural acceptance or the cultural expectation was versus what it is now. I think that it's significantly different. So in saying all of that, the one thing that I really wanted to touch on that I think really gives leaning to this idea of dual income, no kids. And what I wanted to get to and how I think that it is a reminiscent and reflective reality of hedonism in our culture, and how I think that that is directly correlated in a comparison with the ancient Roman culture that necessitated Augustus to make the changes that he made, or to attempt to insert the Lex Julia laws to re-incentivize the family. The reason I see that as a connection is based off of this specific statistic. And so according to Pew, that's PEW, in 2021, when I saw this percentage, it literally exploded my brain. And that was if 44% of non-parents aged 18 to 49, that's literally everybody for the most part that is in childbearing age. In 2021, of that entire group of people, 44% said that they are not likely to have children ever. And also in 2023, the US birth rates have fallen to their lowest level in recorded history. And there's also child-free content on things like TikTok and Reddit, and they have tens of millions of views under hashtags like hashtag child-free and hashtag DINKLife, dual income, no kids. And so my argument is I look at this number, which, I mean, I can't describe to people how not sensationalistic, right? Like, I want people to leave this podcast with a lighter heart than they had when they came. And when I tell you this, and when I say this, and I share this, there is hope. There's hope. The light has shined in the darkness, and the darkness is not overcome. If the entirety of childbearing adults in a civilization, if 44% of them are saying that they are not going to have children ever, you live in a civilization that is collapsing. And when I say a civilization is collapsing, what I'm not saying is that the lights are going to go out, and that the infrastructure is going to fail, and that we're going to be an apocalyptic, we're going to be in an apocalyptic world with, Denzel Washington walking around blind with a backpack. And then what was that really, really, really interesting show on, it was on Amazon Prime. What was it? It was recent, Fallout. It was a really, really good show. But, everybody's in there. That's not what I'm saying when I say that the civilization is collapsing. What I'm simply saying is that the American way of life, the understanding of what American civilization is, it is going to disappear as we know it eventually. Because if half the population of childbearing aged males and females are saying that they're not going to reproduce, it's literally nothing more than a numbers game at that point. And I argue that one of the key factors that is influencing this is a hedonistic culture in which we are prioritizing ourselves and our own happiness above the family, above things that the family then in turn impacts, which is community, which is culture, which is reproduction. If a civilization is going to disappear, that is one way to disappear. And that is by the civilization of itself literally not reproducing itself. And again, what I'm arguing and what I'm presenting is kind of, again, this is a closing out of a brief analysis of Arthur John Hubbard's book, The Fate of Empires. And in that book, he talks about Caesar Augustus trying to incentivize the family because the culture of the day was hedonistic and people were not pursuing the family. They were not pursuing the things that had led to the society's greatness. They had forsaken those things to pursue personal pleasure, personal happiness. They were minimizing anything that could lead to their discomfort or anything that would get them off track of trying to get to the comfort they were pursuing or the happiness or the pleasure, whatever they're pursuing. They were minimizing anything that would have that impact, and they were maximizing anything that would allow them to seek out and to pursue that pleasure. And anybody who's been married, anybody who has children, everybody who has been in those situations knows self-sacrifice is the order of the day inside of a marriage relationship and inside of being a parent. It is literally the end of yourself. And it is a complete focus on others. Now, that's a very utopianistic way of putting it. Does it look like that day to day? Absolutely not. It is a constant battle against wanting to prioritize yourself or prioritize your family or prioritize others over yourself. It is a constant tension. And as I said at the beginning of this podcast, if you want a clear understanding of the nature of man, get married and have children. Because if you do, you are very quickly going to realize the level of selfish orientation in our hearts to seek out our own happiness, to seek out our own wants, our own pleasures. I could not have fathomed how selfish I am until after I got married, until after I had children. So there is no more opposite reality in this world than hedonism, than having a family. And so when I look at our culture and I see the childbearing age demographic in our society, almost half of it is saying that they're not going to have children. That is far more than people who physically can't have children. I know people who would love to have children, but they physically can't. I mean, my heart goes out to those people. I know people who they have chosen to be single in their life, but it's not because they're pursuing personal pleasure. It's because they're devoting themselves to other things that are serving other people's in different ways, in which them being single is a mechanism for that to be more effective. There are a myriad of people who are not getting married and not having kids for good reasons. But I guarantee you, I want to be very careful not to be sensationalistic, right? I've talked about that. But I don't think I'm taking too big of a leap to say it is absolutely and unequivocally impossible for the people like that to make up 44% of the people in our civilization that are able to bear children, that are able to have children, that are able to provide for children, that are able to have a family, right? Men and women who can get married together and build families together. It is absolutely and unequivocally impossible that the people that are choosing to stay single for good reason and not have children for good reason, that they make up 44% of the demographic of the people that can have kids and build families in our culture. And so then what is it? And I would argue that it's hedonism. I would argue that there is a culture that exists in our world and in my nation that people are pursuing their own personal pleasure, their own personal happiness, and that is being set above the family. Or because, again, maximizing and minimizing, I've said it multiple times, you will find no greater example of a mechanism to teach yourself to sacrifice yourself in your own wants, your own pleasure, your own happiness, than to be in a marriage relationship and then to have children. And if you want to do either of those well, of which I am not a person that can say that I do, I'm learning a lot, I'm failing even more. However, in those failures, what I'm learning is that if you want to do the marriage relationship right, it is the end of yourself. If you want to be a good parent, it is the end of yourself. That is the reality of that is the reality of marriage. And so what do then people in turn see that as? They see the family and the idea of family, they see it as a restriction. And my argument is that instead of seeing it as a restriction and a lack of freedom, that as a result of my worldview and the assumptions that come along with that worldview, there are times where things in our world that may seem to the eye to be quote unquote restrictive, there's actually great freedom in that quote unquote restriction that comes as a result of that. That there is great freedom to be found in the limits that are placed around us by these institutions, one of which is marriage and one of which is the family. The family, it serves not as a wall to restrict us from getting out, but as a mechanism to protect us from something getting in. And that would be my argument for the family, is that it's not a restriction. Now, that it does come with self-sacrifice. It does come with saying no to things that may be physically pleasuring, to things that may be pleasuring to the eye. However, in the end, those momentary pleasures, what could they potentially be in the end? And is the cost-benefit analysis of pursuing those pleasures, if you do that, what could it result in? Either A, it could result in a very unfulfilling life, and the quote-unquote freedom that you said that you give yourself then in turn results in you having a complete and total lack of satisfaction. And this, again, like I said, and I'm going to keep saying it through these next few minutes as I close out this episode, is I am not talking about people who are staying single and people who are not having children for good reason. I am not talking about that. I am talking about a hedonistic culture in which people are pursuing their own pleasure and happiness above anything else, to the expense of things like the family. And from a cultural and societal perspective, like I said, on the next episode, I'm going to talk about it from a more philosophical, ideological, political, economic perspective as it relates to Marxism and the modern socialist movement that's really, really gaining a lot of traction, not only in my culture, but around the world. So I'm not going into that right now. What I'm talking about is a societal and a cultural idea that, hey, your own personal pleasure and happiness is what matters most, to the point to which half of the childbearing population is saying, I am not going to have kids. There's a lot of people who are missing out on something that is wonderful. There's a lot of people who are missing out on something that they perceive as restriction, but what it actually is a mechanism for the benefit of society. It's a mechanism for a benefit of the civilization. It's a mechanism for the, not only for the survival and the benefit, but for the flourishing of the civilization. And in the end, though it may seem from the outside looking in like it's a restriction, once you get inside of it and once you learn how to operate within it, and listen, I'm not utopianistic. I have seen marriages ripped apart. I fully appreciate and understand that there are times in marriage that it is an absolute dogfight and a slugfest day after day after day. I understand that, not because my marriage is awful, because it's not. My wife She's cleverer than I am. She's better than I am. She's smarter than I am. She's more capable and steadier than I am. She's everything that I am not, which is a blessing beyond anything that I can convey because it sharpens me in ways that I never could have imagined. But you think for a second that it's not absolutely and utterly infuriating, that I'm constantly being challenged to be not in a negative or bad way, but because I'm trying to go this way, but that way is not a good way. And my wife is there to help sharpen and steady and balance and challenge. And I don't want any part of that because I want what I want. But in the end, on the back end, when I see it from the other side, I think to myself, thank you. Thank you that you helped me. And then when you stack those experiences one after the other, after the other, after the other, you begin to not see marriage as a restriction, but you see it as a bulwark of protection against things that would then rip you apart and rip you down. Our culture paints it as a hedonistic restriction, and it's not. It's not that. Now, can it be? Sure. If you have people in a marriage who are completely focused on themselves, it's absolutely going to be miserable. So you can carry that hedonism with you into a marriage relationship, and people often do, and I did. That's how I was when I first got married. Good gracious. It was brutal. But God's been gracious and merciful. And when I've fallen short, when I've failed, God has forgiven me. My wife has forgiven me. And then you stack it and stack it and stack it and stack it. And then again, like I said, in the end, you realize that it's not a restriction, but it's a protection, which is the complete antithesis of this idea of DINK, dual income, no kids. And even though for a time, there's no doubt that there's going to be a lot of fun associated with that, but in the end, if you're denying these not only societal and civilizational foundational necessities, the family, it's a necessity. It says a lot about the day and age and the culture that we live in that people can do this. That says a lot about the freedoms that we have. It says a lot about the prosperity of the culture that we live in, the security of the culture that we live in. So you think about those individuals having so much freedom, so much prosperity, so much security, that they don't even have to consider having a family just to make sure that their line, that their lineage, that their name is carried on into the next generation. That type of stuff doesn't matter as much as it used to. And I think a lot of that's just because the life expectancy in the modern day is so much higher than it was. It says in the Bible that God has numbered our days. So I have learned very quickly in my life through my own personal experiences not to put a lot of incentive on tomorrow because I'm not promised it. So living with this idea that, hey, the average age is 70, 80 years before people die in our culture. I can stave all this stuff off. And then things like the family, they're not a necessity anymore. It's like, well, I'm not going to die till I'm 80, so I don't need to worry about a family. I can think about that either later or I don't have to worry about it at all. Somebody else will do it. And then you have enough people stacking on top of each other like that, and then all of a sudden you have almost half of the childbearing population or child-rearing population, and they're not even having kids. And I keep going back to that because when I know I'm not trying to, I'm kind of beating a dead horse, but I mean, people have to, this was less than 4 years ago that this Pew survey took place. 2 years after it, the U.S. birth rate had fallen to the lowest levels in recorded history. Almost 50% of the people that can have children are saying that they're not going to do it. That is within two generations. I mean, how does that even look? But when all you think about is your own personal pleasure in the moment, and you give no considerations to the second or to the third, fourth order effects of that decision, the civilization will fall. And I think that there's no greater example of this. And I'm going to close out the podcast with this example. And I'm actually going to put the link to this podcast in the description, whether it's on the video podcast on YouTube, or quarter of a video on this one, whether it's on YouTube, Spotify, or whether it's on Apple or one of the other platforms. This was an interview on a podcast called The Diary of a CEO. I forget what it's called when you use letters to describe something. It's a military thing. Acronyms, there it is. All right, so it's DOAC, and it's The Diary of a CEO. It's a massive podcast. It has like 11 million subscribers, I think, or something like that. So on this, the interviewer of this podcast, the guy who runs it, he's a really, really, really good podcast host. He's a really good interviewer, does a great job. And he did a podcast with a gentleman by the name of Eric Weinstein, who is a physicist. And in this podcast, I would encourage anybody on this topic of the family and the things that I've described and related them in comparison to the hedonistic reality of the day of the Romans, and how I see that same type of hedonism taking shape and form in my society and culture. And Eric Weinstein, who is a family man, he has this interview with these young professionals, because the gentleman doing this interview on this is probably in his 30s, I would say, would be my guess. And Eric Weinstein challenged him heavily on the reality of the family. But the reason that I really appreciated this is Eric Weinstein is a gentleman who would be on the complete polar opposite of my worldview. And that's why I really enjoyed looking at and seeing his perspective, because this is just, and the reason I wanted to do this is, I say I'm a Christian and I start talking about the importance of the family. What does everybody then immediately think and say? Everybody says this: you're a conservative, you're a far right wing, probably conservative crazy. You're just an old conservative byproduct of a bygone era. You are just the standard Midwestern closed-minded cultural Christian who has no idea of the world, who has a tiny worldview. You've grown up in the Bible Belt. Like, all of those things probably go along with somebody who is like me. With my worldview is going to be probably the predominant counter response to someone like me presenting the importance of the family. They're going to be like, man, haven't you guys died out yet? I mean, good grief. I thought you guys were done in the early 2000s, in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s. Like, good gracious. And that's going to be the predominant response to somebody like me presenting this. However, Eric Weinstein, he is a world-renowned physicist. He is an atheist, completely opposite on the spectrum in my worldview. And it was actually kind of hilarious. He said, he did a presentation at the ARC conference, which is held by Jordan Peterson. A lot of great speakers there. Eric Weinstein, during that conference, he goes, "I'm an atheist, Jewish, liberal," is pretty much what he said. And I thought it was hysterical. But anyway, he's brilliant, right? So very different worldviews he and I would have, but he talked about the importance of the family. And he talked about how it's so important that these young people understand how important this is. And again, I would encourage, I'll put the link in the description. Take a look at this podcast if you want to. It's just listen to the first 25 minutes, if anything else, and just listen to what he says about the family. And again, this is a guy who has a completely opposite worldview than I do. So this isn't somebody like me with a theistic worldview who's saying, I believe in God and I believe that God instituted the family, which I do. This is an atheist talking about the importance of the family. This is somebody who has the complete opposite assumption. I talked about it a couple podcasts ago, and I talked about it even at the beginning of this podcast when I kind of went on that Marxist monologue. There is a primary assumption that is at the beginning of everything that we deal with in our lives, everything. And it is a worldview assumption that there is either A, there is a God, or B, there is not. This individual that I'm talking about, Dr. Weinstein, he is on the opposite side of that avenue than I am. He does not believe that there's a God, and I do. We have completely opposite assumptions about the reality of the universe in which we live, and yet we are both still coming to the same conclusion. And that is why I felt like it was worthwhile to go through his brief discussion here. Dr. Weinstein said, quote, "We're becoming too sophisticated. We got too much information. We're deranging ourselves. We're having a blast. And we're completely undoing the superstructure of the world. The number of people who don't have children or want children. My kids make fun of me because I just go around telling people to make babies. And it's the most normal thing in the world. I meet parents who don't harass their children to get married and have families. I'm like, what are you doing?" End quote. I mean, look at what Dr. Weinstein said right there. He said, what? We're having a blast. That's hedonism 101. Everybody's having fun, pursuing their own ends, pursuing their own happiness, pursuing their own pleasure. Everybody's having a blast. And then what does he say? We're undoing the superstructures of the world. I mean, you couldn't find a better interaction, a better quote, a better idea of what is being communicated in this podcast. You can't provide a better quote that summarizes why Caesar Augustus instituted the Lex Julia laws You can't find a better example or a better quote summarizing the reality of 44% of the childbearing or child rearing age men and women in America not having children or not wanting to have children at all. There is no better summarization of that reality than in this quote by Dr. Weinstein, a man who has a completely different worldview than I do. And he also said, Dr. Weinstein said this, he said, quote, "I had a really rich life. Take somebody who hasn't had those opportunities, but they had a chance to have 3 kids. I'm not sure I wouldn't trade places. I so enjoyed raising my kids. It's available to everyone," end quote. And I just, man, I was so taken back by this podcast. And I so appreciated what Dr. Weinstein had to say to this young man. Because this young man that he was talking to, who's from England, he didn't have any children and anything either. And Dr. Weinstein was challenging him on this point. And in the end, what he was saying in this, he said, this joy of having children, he said, it's available to everyone. And so my argument in our culture is this, is that there has been such a devaluation of the family, both in hedonism, but also there's been a political and ideological attack against the family by what we'll get into in the next episode, which is the Marxist influence in the modern socialist movement, which is heavily influenced with feminism as well. And in the end, what that ideology does is it completely strips the family of anything that would be of joy and love and all of these things associated with what it's like when you look at your child. And it virtually, it strips down the family to nothing more than unpaid economic work. It's not a work of love. It's not a labor of love. Not in the Marxist ideology. It's unpaid labor in the family. That's what it reduces parenting to. They could not be more wrong. I know that this isn't 100% the case. I know it's not. I know that there's people in the world who their parents bailed on them. So I'm not talking about this in utopianistic terms. I know that it's not always the case. We live in a broken, fallen world. And it's ugly. And it's hard sometimes. I know. So I can't speak for everybody. But I can speak for myself. Which is, if you are living in a culture where people are denying themselves what Dr. Weinstein said, it's available to everyone. To be able to look at your child at night and to be able to just see them laying there as they go to sleep, and to feel the love in your heart for your child, or to see your wife laying there as you go for work in the morning, and your heart is filled with the complete opposite of what the Marxists would say. The idea of it not being a labor of love is the most nonsensical thing I've ever heard in my life. It's wrong. They are wrong. It is a labor of love. And the more you do it, the more love there is in it. And it's not perfection. That's one of the biggest things that I take away from that is it's not perfection. It's hard and it's ugly and it's work. It's just work and work and work. It's exhausting. However, it is right. And I remember one time, I think it was in a movie one time that I heard a quote, and it's always stuck with me because I think it's a good quote, because I think it's simple, but it's true. And it just said, and the quote said, "Do what is right because it is right." And I just, that's taken away. So I've kind of gone full, freaking motivational speaker here in these last few minutes. I just, what Dr. Weinstein said about the joy of parenting and how it's available to everyone really stuck out to me. It really stuck out to me a lot. And again, this is a common man presenting his opinion. I know that we live in a very broken world. There's a lot of people who are in situations and circumstances where they're like, dude, you think that I'm going to bring a kid into this right now? You are nuts. I understand that. There's people who are like, well, you get to look at your child at night while he sleeps, while you're in peace in the middle of America. Good for you, buddy. I'm over here in Gaza, and I have absolutely no freaking idea how I'm going to feed my children. I have no idea how I'm going to keep them alive for the next 24 hours. I know that that's the reality of the world that we live in. I know that those are the dichotomies. I've been in environments where I understand that fully and completely. And I'll simply close out this podcast by saying there's hope. And oftentimes the response to people, especially in my position, living in peace and in security with a full belly, and my children go to bed tonight with full bellies. I don't take it for granted, not for 1 second. And they're like, who are you to say there is hope? Easy for you to say. And, I would receive that criticism. I understand that anybody that would present that perspective, and when people are in the midst of suffering, it's hard to even resist that challenge. However, the reality is that truth and what is true, the beauty of truth is that it does not ebb and flow and change with our circumstances. And that's why there's hope. Because if truth was relative, if it was like the materialist philosophy of the Marxist, and the material reality of the human person is then the indicator of that person's human nature, and the reality of the world just ebbed and flowed and went back and forth and up and down with the material reality of our lives, it would be very difficult to find hope in anything. Because in that there is no truth. In that there is simply one reality. You either have what you need to be happy or you don't. If you don't have it, you're not. If you do, you are. That's a horrible way to live your life because your circumstances drive everything. However, my worldview and my belief is that that is not the reality of the world. My worldview and my belief is that there is hope. And that there is hope regardless of the circumstances. And that's what I believe. And that's why I would encourage anybody that if they are actively avoiding the idea of marriage or the idea of a family, and it's solely and completely based off the fact they just want what's easy, they want what's best for them, they want their pleasure, I would lovingly encourage them to maybe just take a step back and just think about it. That's all. Just take a step back and think about it. You don't want to rush into a marriage with the wrong person, that's for sure. That's not a decision that's to be taken lightly. That's not the decision to be rushed into. And it's better to wait till you're 35 and marry someone who has character, who you align with. That's much better than to just get married on a whim when you're early 20s just because you want to. So, I'm not a counselor, and nobody's listening to this to be counseled. So please forgive me for the monologue, and please forgive me for the motivational speech. It's not my intention. This stuff really hits home with me. Because it hits home with me because there's a lie in our culture. And the lie is that if you pursue your own personal pleasure and happiness, you will find the most fulfillment. And I'm telling you, it is a freaking lie. It is not true. And that is coming not only from me and the worldview that I have, but it's coming from an atheist who has the complete opposite worldview that I do. And he is telling you the exact same thing. And so I would just encourage anybody just to consider that. And just to remember that in spite of any of the bleak realities that I may have commented on and talked about, or that I'll go into in the next podcast, because the next one talking about Marxism and the cultural reality of modern socialism and the modern socialist feminist movement as well, and the realities of how that's permeating our culture and why that then in turn is impacting the family from a worldview perspective. That's going to be that's very dark. Because I spent about 3 hours the other day in the Communist Manifesto. So, but lots to be learned and lots to grow in there for me personally. And as I vocalize that, hopefully if there's anybody else who might take a benefit away from that, hopefully that can be a value add to some others. So just in closing today, I tried something new with the microphone in terms of taking off that super poofy thingy that was on there. It helps with the P's and the S's. So if in this episode, the S's, like this sound, if it's really, really, really bad and overwhelming, I apologize. I have headphones in. I tried to do the best I could to mitigate it as much as possible with soundboard and this. However, if it is really, really bad for any reason, I apologize, and I'll try to make an adjustment on the next episode so that it's not so bad. So in the end, that's going to close out this episode for today. And again, I just want to leave this episode just by saying there is hope. There's hope to be found. There's joy, and there's hope. I believe that it is found only and completely in Jesus Christ, and that I would encourage anybody to consider him. However, I know that there will be many who don't share that worldview and who don't align with me on that, whether you do or whether you don't. You are loved, and have a wonderful day. And I look forward to digging in on the next episode, on the next go around. So if you took the time to stop by, thank you. I appreciate you, and have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful day. Thanks.